Ilhan Omar had scarcely completed her description of the President of the United States as a man who had gone bankrupt 6 times when the chamber exploded in the kind of roar that suggested the crowd had been holding its breath for exactly this moment. She allowed herself a smile, proposed that the nation return the individual who had squandered its resources, and observed as 10 million viewers took in the insult as it unfolded live. Her aides were convinced the strategy had succeeded. The contrast was straightforward, charged with feeling, and engineered to position her as the refugee who had surpassed the billionaire who once ridiculed her. For 90 seconds, the hearing room belonged entirely to Ilhan Omar, and she carried herself with the assurance of someone certain the footage had already entered the national bloodstream. The stage had been set for maximum effect excess cameras, a throng of reporters, and the particular tension that gathers when Washington anticipates a clash. Omar sat straight-backed in a burgundy hijab and navy blazer, hands folded, folders precisely aligned, every detail managed, because she understood that body language would be replayed beside every subsequent headline. Her opening traced the refugee camp, the years of waiting, the child who arrived without English, and the successive men who insisted she had no place here. She summoned the 2019 rally in the chant of "Send her back," casting Trump as the aggressor before turning that history directly upon him. Then she set her ascent from nothing against his inheritance and repeated bankruptcies, inviting the audience to judge which of them had truly earned the right to stay. Trump neither defended himself nor interrupted, nor did he produce the wounded look Washington expected or the sterile smile politicians deploy to persuade cameras an insult has missed its mark. He laughed openly, head thrown back, shoulders moving, eyes narrowed, and the room instantly lost the rhythm Omar's team had rehearsed. That laugh mattered. Anger would have confirmed her power, denial would have prolonged her frame, and defensiveness would have left her insult at the center of the exchange. Laughter did the opposite. It diminished the attack and transformed her carefully constructed blow into the setup for whatever he intended next. The applause faltered, certainty evaporated, and Omar's communications staff confronted the single response their plan had never contemplated. Still smiling, Trump leaned into the microphone and repeated, 6 bankruptcies. She had counted. I'm flattered. Usually people only count to 4. He gave the room time to laugh before shifting the subject. He said he had no interest in revisiting his bankruptcies because he had converted those failures into buildings, deals, television, and a political brand strong enough to place him in that room. What he wanted to discuss was her number, a figure more hazardous than any joke because it belonged neither to a business narrative, a tabloid profile, nor an old controversy. The number was $250 million, and he presented it as the central fact in a collapse tied to legislation whose name was nearly impossible. Omar's smile tightened. She grasped, before the audience did, that the hearing was leaving biography behind and moving toward documents. Trump held up a printed page and explained that the Meals Act had been wrapped in language no politician could attack without appearing cruel, for no one wishes to be accused of voting against food for children. He stressed that the measure had passed with bipartisan support and carried the moral armor of a title designed to silence doubt before it could form. Then he reduced the story to arithmetic, the one language Washington cannot smother with personal history, emotional framing, or managed outrage. $250 million had flowed through a program created to feed children. Yet the money had not delivered the result the public had been promised. What Omar had offered as compassion, Trump now described as a pipeline, and the difference between those descriptions began to dominate the chamber. He compared the vanished funds to a magic trick, calling it superior to David Copperfield, except for one distinction. Copperfield eventually restores what he makes disappear, while this money had simply vanished. The line drew laughter from the neutral section, the press gallery, and even several who had cheered Omar minutes earlier, rendering the moment more damaging than any partisan ovation. People laughed before deciding whether they accepted the charge, allowing Trump to make the claim feel self-evident before it had been contested. Omar's left hand drifted toward a folder as if a document inside might reverse the room, yet the folder stayed closed and the gesture ended before becoming a rebuttal in a chamber saturated with cameras. That incomplete movement registered as the first visible sign that she had not anticipated the numbers. Trump then asked how many meals had actually been served with the money, paused long enough for the audience to answer in silence, and hinted that the figure was perfectly round. The answer, he said, was zero, not a disappointing fraction, not bureaucratic shortfall, but 0 meals delivered for $250 million spent. The room stopped laughing because the number converted the exchange from entertainment into accusation and compelled everyone to confront the scale of the alleged failure. He followed with the prosecution total: 79 people indicted, 56 who had pleaded guilty, and 89% of those prosecuted Somali. Those figures struck directly at the identity Omar had employed as protection, because the program had supposedly existed to serve her community, while the prosecution centered on people from that same community. The supporters behind her did not become Trump voters, nor did they need to. The damage arose from doubt rather than conversion. A woman in a blue hijab shifted in her seat with the restrained unease of someone hearing information she had not expected from the man she had expected to oppose. Trump framed the episode as a betrayal committed in the name of children, money collected under the banner of mercy, and then absorbed by a system that rewarded connections instead of feeding families. He turned the next page and introduced Safari Restaurant, a business Omar had publicly praised in Somali for allegedly serving thousands of meals each day. Then he stated that prosecutors had concluded the restaurant had served 0 meals, burying Omar's opening triumph beneath the first wave of figures she had never expected to answer. Safari Restaurant was neither a side note, nor an isolated vendor, nor a minor accounting irregularity that could be concealed beneath the usual fog of administrative language. Trump identified it as the largest fraud site in the network and reminded the room that Omar had praised it publicly in Somali for supposedly serving 2,300 meals a day. The significance lay not merely in the meals that were never served, but in the fact that the praise had helped lend credibility to an operation prosecutors later described as empty. He emphasized that 0 children had been fed while money moved into luxury cars, real estate, and overseas transfers, making the public celebration look less like community advocacy and more like cover. The room grasped the problem at once. Once a politician personally validates a program that later collapses under criminal prosecutions, distance becomes far harder to manufacture. Then Trump introduced the Treasury Department, and the atmosphere shifted because Treasury tracing meant the story no longer ended with fraudulent invoices inside Minnesota. It meant federal investigators were following funds across borders, examining accounts, transfers, destinations, and the financial architecture used after the money left the original program. Omar's jaw tightened a movement small enough to escape a casual observer, yet visible to every camera trained on the witness table. Her composure remained technically intact, yet the confidence that had defined her opening had vanished, because confidence depends on knowing which questions are coming. She had prepared to combat accusations of racism, xenophobia, and political targeting, but she had not prepared to answer a trail of money moving beyond the country. Omar reached for the defense that had shielded her through years of political combat, arguing that the scrutiny formed part of a campaign targeting Muslims and Somali Americans. The argument had worked before because it converted criticism of her conduct into an attack on an entire community, forcing opponents to defend their motives rather than examine her record. Trump refused the frame and stated that ICE was not in Minneapolis because of him, but because $250 million had been stolen through a program connected to her legislation. He then asked the question that stripped away the shield, whether the Somali community was being targeted by the person asking where the money went or by the politician whose law allowed it to disappear. That question cut deeper than an insult because it placed Omar's identity and her performance in direct conflict, demanding that the community judge results rather than slogans. The people seated behind her neither erupted, nor booed, nor rushed to her defense, and their silence carried more weight than any partisan reaction could have produced. A man wearing a kufi removed his "Stand with Ilhan" button and turned it over in his hand not as a theatrical rejection, but as the private gesture of someone reconsidering loyalty. Trump had not converted the room ideologically, yet he had forced the audience to examine whether political protection had become a substitute for accountability. That distinction mattered because supporters can survive disagreement, but they begin to fracture when they suspect their loyalty has been used to shield transactions they were never told about. Omar had entered the room as the unquestioned representative of a community. The numbers were now separating the community from the person who claimed to speak for it. Trump moved from public money to personal money, shifting the hearing from legislative oversight to federal disclosures and the financial condition of Omar's household. He held up 3 pages and described a transformation so extreme that even Washington's most practiced defenders could not make it sound ordinary. In 2023, her husband's reported business assets stood at approximately $51,000, a modest figure, consistent with a small consulting operation and nothing that would attract serious attention. In 2024, the figure on the same disclosure line reportedly jumped to a range between $6 million and $30 million, an increase too large to dismiss as routine growth. Trump mocked the leap as alchemy, yet the force of the point came from the paperwork, because a federal disclosure does not become less binding simply because the number is embarrassing. The next amendment made the situation worse rather than better, because the same assets were later listed at approximately $95,000, and the difference was described as an accounting error. Trump noted that a $29.9 million discrepancy was not the kind of error produced by a misplaced decimal or an overlooked receipt. It was an entirely different answer to the same question submitted on forms that carried legal obligations and consequences. Omar pressed her hand against the edge of the table, the restrained physical reaction of someone trying to remain motionless while the room moved against her. The audience was no longer evaluating a political accusation. It was comparing 3 federal filings and recognizing that at least 2 versions could not simultaneously be true. Trump then turned to Rose Lake Capital, the company connected to Tim Minette, and focused on its claim of managing $60 billion in assets. A firm controlling that amount would belong among major financial institutions, would attract extensive regulatory attention, and would normally possess an infrastructure visible far beyond a rented desk. Yet the company was not presented as a major Wall Street operation with offices, analysts, compliance departments, and an established public footprint. Trump said it operated from a WeWork address, reducing the grand claim to the image of a company boasting tens of billions while renting space by the hour. The room laughed because the contrast was absurd, but beneath the laughter sat the obvious regulatory question of how such a claim could exist without immediate scrutiny. The hearing then reached the $2.78 million Omar's campaign had paid to E Street Group between 2019 and 2020, money collected from donors who believed they were funding her political movement. E Street Group belonged to Tim Minette, the consultant Omar was dating before marrying him, which transformed a campaign expense into a personal conflict impossible to explain through generic language about political services. Trump emphasized that the money did not come from Omar's private account, but from supporters sending small amounts because they trusted her to represent them. He invoked Amira, a prep cook earning $26,000 a year and donating $50 a month, forcing the room to see the sacrifice hidden behind every line of campaign finance data. When Omar finally said that payments to political consultants were standard, Trump answered without laughter. Standard practice doesn't include marrying the consultant. And the defense collapsed under 9 words. Omar's mouth closed, not because she had accepted Trump's argument, but because any response now risked extending the exact conflict she needed to escape. Her eyes shifted toward her attorney, who continued writing with the concentration of a man who understood that eye contact could become its own televised admission. The consultant defense had sounded acceptable in the abstract, yet the marriage made the arrangement personal, and personal arrangements funded by donors are harder to bury beneath industry language. Trump did not repeat the line because he did not need to. The room had heard it clearly, and repetition would only weaken a sentence already sharp enough to stand alone. He simply straightened in his chair, let the silence settle, and prepared to move from embarrassing disclosures to something far more dangerous. His voice dropped, the grin faded, and the hearing suddenly stopped feeling like a televised argument between 2 political enemies. Trump said everything discussed so far was public record available on federal forms, court filings, campaign disclosures, and documents anyone could examine without trusting his interpretation. The $250 million Safari restaurant, the changing asset figures, Rose Lake Capital, and the $2.78 million were not rumors produced by an anonymous account. They were figures already sitting inside government systems, waiting for someone powerful enough, reckless enough, or shameless enough to place them together on live television. The spectacle had brought the audience into the room, but the documents were now doing the work that spectacle alone could never accomplish. Then Trump said the public material was not the most important part, because behind closed doors, the federal investigation had expanded beyond the original prosecutions. He described new subpoenas, new targets, and new documents connected to the Feeding Our Future network, making clear that the first wave of indictments was not the conclusion. That announcement removed Omar's easiest escape, because she could no longer dismiss the matter as a completed scandal involving people outside her office. An expanded investigation meant federal authorities believed additional money, additional actors, or additional transactions remained unresolved, and unresolved federal transactions rarely become less serious with time. The audience leaned forward because the hearing was no longer reviewing an old disaster. It was exposing an active process still moving through the institutions of government. Trump said investigators were following the money after it left Minnesota, focusing not only on where the funds originated, but where they traveled afterward. He confirmed that the Treasury Department was tracing transfers connected to entities within the network, including money sent to accounts outside the United States. He refused to identify the country, claiming the investigation remained active, but added that Omar knew which country he meant and that the public would know soon. The sentence was calculated because it offered no destination the press could immediately verify, yet it placed Omar inside a circle of implied knowledge she could not easily deny. Her body became completely still, and for several seconds every camera captured a woman who had spent the evening responding instantly, suddenly choosing not to move. The press gallery reacted before the supporters did because reporters understood the institutional significance of what the president had just confirmed. Phones appeared beneath the tables, messages moved toward editors and producers, and prepared stories were abandoned as the hearing changed category in real time. An argument about bankruptcies and political hypocrisy had become an on-camera disclosure about expanded DOJ activity and Treasury tracing linked to a major fraud network. The story could no longer be contained inside partisan commentary because financial investigators, federal prosecutors, compliance attorneys, and congressional staff would all read those words differently. Trump had not merely won a televised exchange, he had inserted active federal machinery into a confrontation Omar had expected to control through rhetoric. He continued by saying the IRS was reviewing the tax and business filings connected to Rose Lake Capital, the company claiming billions in managed assets from a WeWork address. That detail drew another short laugh, but the laughter was nervous now because the IRS is not a punchline when federal disclosures contain wildly inconsistent valuations. A company could exaggerate its stature on a website, but once those claims collided with official forms, tax filings, and the spouse of a member of Congress, the exaggeration became harder to treat as harmless marketing. Trump presented the review as an inevitable reaction to figures too large, too unstable, and too contradictory to ignore. The company had survived obscurity, but obscurity ended the moment its numbers were read aloud before 10 million people. Then came the grand jury subpoenas, the phrase that stripped the final layer of political theater from the room. Trump said records had been demanded from Tim Mynette's businesses, including E Street Group, EST Crew, and Rose Lake Capital, placing the entities inside a formal investigative process. Grand jury activity did not prove guilt, but it proved that prosecutors were no longer satisfied with press releases, amended disclosures, or public explanations. They wanted documents, communications, financial records, and the kind of material that cannot be rewritten once it has been produced under legal compulsion. Trump smiled briefly after announcing the subpoenas, not because the matter was funny, but because he understood that Omar's opening insult had now become almost irrelevant. The chairman offered Omar an opportunity to respond, and she stood because silence would have looked like surrender, even though speaking offered no clean path out. She accused the administration of political targeting, weaponizing the Justice Department, and using the Somali community as collateral in a campaign against her. The language was familiar, disciplined, and delivered with the controlled anger of someone who had survived harsher personal attacks than anything spoken in that hearing room. Yet the defense addressed motive rather than substance, focusing on why Trump wanted the investigation while avoiding the figures and transactions that made the investigation possible. In another hearing, that strategy might have worked, but this room was now carrying too many numbers for a motive argument to erase them. No answer explained how $250 million disappeared from a program designed to feed children, or why Safari Restaurant had been praised for meals prosecutors said never existed. No answer reconciled $51,000 with as much as $30 million and then approximately $95,000 on the same financial disclosures. No answer explained the credibility of a $60 billion claim tied to a rented workspace, or why millions in campaign funds flowed to a consultant Omar later married. No answer addressed the expanded investigation, the overseas tracing, the IRS review, or the subpoenas directed at her husband's businesses. Omar's words landed cleanly, but they landed on concrete, unable to take root because every accusation of prejudice now collided with a document Trump had already placed before the cameras. Trump did not interrupt, grin, or offer another line for social media because the hearing had reached the point where another attack would have looked unnecessary. He leaned back, watched the gallery, and allowed Omar's defense to exhaust itself against evidence she had not directly confronted. The supporters who had celebrated her opening remained silent, not because they trusted Trump, but because distrust of Trump did not answer the questions now hanging over her. A button that had read "Stand with Ilhan" sat unclaimed on an empty chair, a small object carrying the weight of a loyalty no longer worn with certainty. Omar had begun the evening demanding that America send back the man who wasted its money. By the end of the hearing, the only thing Trump had sent back was the receipt. Outside the hearing room, Omar's communications director stared at the statement his team had prepared before the cameras ever turned on. It described a congresswoman confronting the president over racism, immigration, and the political weaponization of fear because that was the confrontation they had expected and the victory they had planned to sell. The statement was useless now because the hearing had not remained centered on Trump's record, his language, or his treatment of Omar. It had moved relentlessly toward her legislation, her financial disclosures, her campaign payments, her husband's companies, and the federal investigations now surrounding those entities. He deleted the prepared language, opened a new document, typed "the representative," and stopped, because no communication strategy could transform subpoenas and financial tracing into a triumphant press release. Two clips dominated the aftermath. The first began exactly where Omar believed she had won. It showed her calling Trump a six-time bankrupt, suggesting that America send him back, and receiving the roar of a gallery convinced it had just witnessed political humiliation. Then came Trump's laughter, real enough to collapse the seriousness of the insult, followed by his pivot from her count of his bankruptcies to his count of her numbers. The clip reached tens of millions of views because the laugh changed the hierarchy of the exchange, making Omar appear less like the aggressor and more like the person who had unknowingly delivered the opening line for Trump's response. Her insult survived online, but it survived as part of his setup, which was precisely the opposite of what her team had intended. The second clip carried no comedy because it contained the announcement of expanded federal action, Treasury tracing, IRS review, and grand jury subpoenas. It circulated through legal circles, compliance forums, investigative communities, and financial networks that normally ignored the theatrical shouting of congressional hearings. Those audiences understood that a president discussing active investigations on camera was not merely producing a campaign slogan, especially when he identified agencies, entities, and investigative tools. Once those statements entered the public record, every denial would be judged against future court filings, agency confirmations, and documents produced under subpoena. Omar could call the hearing political theater, but theater does not explain why federal institutions were already moving through the businesses and transactions Trump had named. During the first week, Omar's office released a statement accusing the administration of disguising political prosecution as legitimate oversight. The statement attacked motive, language, and targeting, but it did not directly answer the $250 million Safari restaurant, the changing asset disclosures, the payments to E Street Group, or the expanding investigation. That omission was not accidental, because every available answer carried a new risk, and the safest public response was therefore the one that addressed almost none of the substance. Yet avoiding the substance only sharpened the impression that the numbers were harder to challenge than the man presenting them. In federal defense language, an argument about why investigators are asking questions often becomes an unintentional admission that the questions themselves cannot be answered cleanly. The reaction inside Minneapolis was more dangerous for Omar than any speech from Trump because it came from people she had long claimed as her political foundation. Somali-American business owners and community leaders called for transparency regarding the distribution and oversight of funds connected to the Meals Act. They did not denounce her, endorse Trump, or surrender their political identity because they did not need to do any of those things to create pressure. They simply asked her to cooperate, and that request carried moral force precisely because it came from the community invoked whenever her conduct faced scrutiny. A subpoena can compel documents, but a demand for answers from one's own supporters can destroy the loyalty that makes political survival possible. 6 days after the hearing, the Department of Justice confirmed that the Feeding Our Future investigation had expanded. The confirmation was restrained, procedural, and stripped of Trump's showmanship. But that restraint made it more damaging because institutions do not need applause to exercise power. The department referred to additional financial instruments and cross-border transactions, validating the central direction of the announcement without revealing targets or compromising active work. Trump had made the expansion theatrical, but the government's confirmation made it institutional. And institutional language is far harder to dismiss as a personal feud. Omar's team could attack the president's delivery, yet the machinery continued moving after the cameras left, which exposed the limits of treating every investigation as performance. The IRS also opened a preliminary review involving Rose Lake Capital's filings and business claims, including the extraordinary asset figures associated with the company. The issue was not merely that the firm presented itself as managing $60 billion while operating from a WeWork address, though the contrast invited ridicule on its own. The larger problem was that the company's public claims, federal disclosures, and revised valuations appeared to describe entirely different financial realities. Bureaucratic systems often ignore contradictions until attention becomes unavoidable, and 10 million viewers made avoidance far more difficult than it had been before the hearing. Trump had not created the discrepancies by reading them aloud, but by reading them aloud, he ensured that every agency capable of examining them would now be judged for failing to act. By the third week, Tim Mynette's attorney confirmed receipt of subpoenas connected to E Street Group, EST Crew, and Rose Lake Capital. The statement said Mynette would cooperate with lawful requests, language chosen carefully because denying the existence of the investigation was no longer an available option. There was no declaration that the subpoenas were imaginary, no claim that the companies had never handled the transactions, and no attempt to pretend prosecutors lacked authority. Cooperation did not establish guilt, but it established that the legal process was real, active, and serious enough to require counsel. The hearing had therefore moved beyond viral confrontation and into the slower territory where documents, records, transfers, and sworn explanations replace applause as the only currency that matters. Omar's campaign raised approximately $3.1 million in 2 weeks, proving once again that controversy can produce money even while it produces doubt. Yet the geography of the donations shifted, with more support arriving from New York, California, and Massachusetts, and less enthusiasm coming from Minnesota. That change mattered because distant donors respond to national symbolism, while district voters respond to schools, businesses, taxes, investigations, and whether their representative answers direct questions. Money from outside the district can protect a political brand, but it cannot fully repair weakening trust among the people who must continue living with the consequences. The fundraising spike looked like strength on a spreadsheet. Yet beneath it sat the more troubling possibility that Omar's national identity was becoming stronger, precisely as her local foundation became less certain. In Cedar Riverside, Amira watched the hearing clip during a break from her work at a Somali restaurant and replayed the moment Trump said her name. He had used her $50 monthly donation and $26,000 annual income to show the sacrifice hidden behind Omar's campaign payments to the company owned by the man she later married. Amira did not cancel the donation that month, issue a statement, or become part of a political campaign against Omar because the damage was quieter than that. For the first time in 6 years, she considered whether the money she gave without hesitation had been treated with the loyalty she believed she was purchasing. Omar had opened the hearing by telling America to send back the man who wasted its money. But Trump ended it by sending back the receipt, and every number on that receipt now belonged to investigators, donors, and a community that had finally begun to ask where its trust had gone.